Thank you, Dr. Vex, for your presentation. And now let me open the panel session that will be moderated by Dr. Kreider. Our team has collected 11 questions, so let's enjoy this conversation together. Dr. Kreider, can you please introduce our panel session?
Sure. Great presentation this morning. Thank you all for participating and watching. We have with us Jurgen, and he did the presentation, if you recall, about creatine history and background and how we got to where we're at. Then we had Stacey Ellery from Australia. Hello, we see you there, and it's about 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. there. We have Dr. Jeff Stout, who helped coordinate this event. And we have Andrew Jagam. Nice job, Andrew. And then we have Diego Benilla. And so we're here to answer the questions. And what we heard so far today is that creatine is very important for metabolic activity in a lot of energy systems, a lot of metabolic roles that have not only fitness and exercise benefit, but also have health benefits in a number of areas that can affect health and medicine. And we heard Dr. Ellery talking about fascinating research on the creatine and prenatal and pregnancy and newborns. Absolutely amazing data. That is a wow effect, as we heard earlier. And we heard Dr. Jagam give us an overview about children and adolescents. And then we heard Dr. Wax go through the teenage years and the early, so we're going from infants now into adulthood. And so we have collected a number of questions. So let me go ahead and ask our moderator to start asking questions.
Thank you very much. So the first question is for Dr. Bassler. Including creatine in food seems like a very interesting proposition. How to regulate to prevent people from overdoing it, but still get the dose associated with health benefits.
No, thank you very much. So I think the key topic with creatine is that it gets water soluble in the body and it's excreted easily. It has no storage effect. So overdosing creatine is certainly not easy to do, and creatine is for exactly also for this reason very safe. So it has no depot effect in the body. The other thing is, of course, when we use and implement creatine in certain food products, we need to make sure that we have the right dosage in. For example, we did some studies on burger patties for 1 gram, for example, and I think this is a right dosage we can people can work with. So we need to find the right dosage also for stability reasons. I mean, if we have the right doses, we have the right stability, and we have the right amount of creatine people then have during their daily creatine consumption. And I think not so many people consume up to 5 or 10 burgers a day. So it might happen, but it will not probably happen very often. So I see a very attractive market there, and creatine is a very safe ingredient there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jurgen. So another question is for Dr. According to what you mentioned in your lecture, can persons with multiple diseases, obese, hypertensive, diabetic, take creatine? Is it safe for them?
Great question. So a lot of studies have looked at individual medical applications, but the reality is that most people, if you have diabetes, you often have associated hypertension and obesity and other problems. So there really are a lot of comorbidities that can be influenced. And what's interesting with creatine is you may get a wider range of activity or impact on health just because it has so many effects on the vascular system and the heart and muscle metabolism and maybe with glucose management. Next 2 days, we're going to go into a lot more detail about that literature. But I do think that it provides general health benefits, and the studies seem to support that. Now, we haven't seen lots of studies where we have 3 or 4 comorbidities and see if that works better than something else. But logically, it would seem to be a benefit for even people with multiple comorbidities.
Thank you very much for your answer. So another question is for Diego. How are intramuscular creatine levels measured?
Okay. Regularly, they are measured through enzymatic analysis. There are several methods that should be considered. All of them, they have different advantages and disadvantages. In this case, the commercial kits are using this kind of NDPAH based reactions that are enzymatic, but there are also nuclear magnetic resonance with phosphorus 31. That is one of the best methods to also analyze the concentrations and the fluctuations of these metabolites. And there are new advances in the mass spectrometry that is coupled to the HPLC using the ultra density new techniques, but these are just so recent in the chemistry field. But I guess that it's depending on the type of not only research, but also what for is this analysis that you are doing for. But in general, those are the most used in the field.
Yeah, let me add also that the general way we measure it is either through a muscle biopsy, where we measure the amount of creatine, phosphocreatine in the tissues, or magnetic resonance spectroscopy, a newer technique that can also measure the ATP phosphocreatine concentrations. But those are generally the 2 main ways that we actually can measure. There's also something you can do because creatine is either absorbed in the body or excreted out in the urine. You can do a whole body creatine retention method where you simply measure how much creatine was ingested and subtract out how much was urinated out. And then you have an idea of how much was retained.
Thank you both very much. So another question is for Dr. Stacy Allery. What strategies can be used to improve the natural adaptations of creatine in placental dysfunctions?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, and I guess a tricky one, because at this stage we can clearly see that these adaptations are occurring, and we're seeing it across multiple different species, multiple different pregnancy insults, but we don't quite understand the mechanism behind the adaptation as yet. Whether the hypoxic environment is perhaps upregulating the creatine transporter protein, which others have reported in different models, or whether there's some other change that's going on. And I guess until we understand that mechanism, we won't be able to better harness what is going on. So there's still some work to do in this space, but we're certainly looking towards doing that and considering, the use of dietary supplements of creatine to better enhance those adaptations. Because I guess one train of thought that we've had is that it's really interesting to see that those natural adaptations are occurring, but what happens if there isn't that supply of creatine there to actually ensure that the adaptation is occurring? So if you do have low creatine levels to start with, can those adaptations actually occur to their greatest advantage, and would a supplement be useful prior to that adaptation occurring? So we still need to look at that a little bit further.
Thank you very much. So another question is for Dr. Kreider. Why do vegetarians respond better to creatine supplementation?
Let me pass that to Jeff Stout. Jeff, can you give us some comments on that to get you involved in the discussion?
Sure. Well, it's because vegetarians don't get a lot of creatine in their diet. We only
Put your mute off.
Is it still off? I turned mine off. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet or a semi-vegetarian diet, they don't get the level of creatine in their diet like an omnivore. And because of that, their levels that have been measured, actually in a study by Roger Harris, that their baseline values, like for instance, an average person is around 120 millimolar per kilogram dry mass or dry muscle. And in vegans, it's down in the 90s, 80s and 90s. So their response to creatine loading and creatine supplementation is much larger.
Thank you very much. Dr. Bassler, another question is for you. Has heterocyclic amine formation in creatine fortified products, which will be exposed to heat, for example, baking or cooking, in absolute as well as relative to traditional meat sources, been assessed? Please indicate frying or grilling conditions studied, or if limited to steam and meat substitute products being considered or developed. Thank you.
This is another very important topic, of course. And I think we have to compare beef meat, for example, with creatine-enriched plant-based substitutes like plant-based burger patties. So there are, from a chemical point of view, there are comparative reactions processing. So, of course, we are grilling beef meat, and we will grill in future, and I'm confident with that, grill plant-based burger patties. But for sure, the key topic is, as the studies we have done show, that we have the right incorporation and the right application technology when we use creatine to produce, for example, these burger patties. So an appropriate mixing and making sure that the creatine is really inside the matrix rather than concentrated at single areas. This is a very, very important topic we need to focus on when we are producing these new type of products. So from a chemical point of view, there are some topics we need to focus on, but our investigations show very promising results, both from the stability point of view and from the applicability point of view of creatine in these burger patties. And there are some companies also in the market who are preparing market products, and they are also doing these preparations, these application studies, and the analytics, of course.
Let me add, in our bioavailability paper that came out a few weeks ago, we overviewed some of the initial studies that Dr. Holtman and Dr. Harris did. And one of the initial studies they did is they compared consuming creatine from meat, about a pound of meat that contained about 5 grams of creatine, to ingesting 2 to 3 grams of creatine monohydrate. And this was cooked meat. And so what the difference was is meat didn't have as high an increase in blood creatine when it stayed sustained over time because it took time to digest, whereas 2 grams of creatine monohydrate causes much of an increase in blood creatine as that food source. And so these are cooked foods. And so when you consume meat in your diet, you cook your salmon, you cook your fish, you cook the things that contain creatine, you still will deliver usually 2 to 3 grams per pound of creatine in that cooked food. And that is the primary source most people get creatine in their diet if they're not taking dietary supplements. So there's been quite a bit of interest in, does cooking degrade the creatine? What happens to it? And most of the studies show that if you lightly cook, you still retain the vast majority of creatine in the food product.
Thank you, both of you. So another question,
or actually 2 questions, are for Dr. Andrew Jagan. So the first one, do you think that training status can moderate the ergogenic effect of creatine in youth? I guess this could be a factor explaining some conflicting results in literature.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's hard to know definitively. I don't think that's been really studied yet. But in addition to training status, I would even add just the type of training that they're doing, and this kind of even ties in with some of the conversations that I often have with young athletes considering taking creatine. Is you also have to put in the work, whether it's in the weight room, on the field, the basketball court. It's not a magic supplement that you can just take and instantly, improve performance. There may be some marginal increases in performance, especially maybe surrounding like anaerobic capacity, but really to kind of enhance training adaptations over time, it would be important that that athlete is following a proper training program that incorporates kind of progressive overload and things like that to really kind of allow for creatine to enhance those training adaptations, assuming they're training at a high enough intensity to do so. So whether it's training status or just the nature of the training that they're doing, I do think that would potentially influence the magnitude of increase, whether it's sport specific performance or again, training adaptations, if it's more of a weight room or sprint performance over time type of variable that you're looking at.
Andrew, thank you so much. And another question is, there has been talk about the safety of creatine in different populations. In children and adolescents, what could be the main risk? Should we request some type of blood test in this population before consuming it?
I wouldn't say there's inherently anything dangerous about creatine, the ingredient itself. The risk may come with what other type of ingredients might be in that particular product or where they're getting that product from in general. It's not a fail-safe rule, but sometimes with dietary supplements, you kind of get what you pay for to some degree. So making sure you're buying products, again, that are manufactured at facilities that follow good manufacturing practices, that subscribe to third parties that, again, assess the quality and purity of that particular ingredient so that you're not buying creatine from someone who's making it in their bathtub online and selling it in Ziploc bags. Obviously, there's risk for low quality supplements. And again, I don't think it's anything specific to creatine. It would be just where are you getting that particular product from and what other things might be in that product if it's a blended product with lots of other ingredients in it and things like that. So making sure people aren't kind of falling victim to, in the pharmaceutical world, I call it polypharmacy, where you're taking lots of doses of different pharmaceutical medications. There could be a similar type of risk with supplements. And again, I don't think it's anything specific to creatine. It would be what other ingredients are in those particular products.
Can I add just one more comment?
Yeah, please do.
I agree with Andrew 100%. The easiest way is just look for CreaPure trademark on the products, and only use creatine. Don't buy those multi-ingredient formulas. I always just tell my athletes, the young athletes, just go for the straight creatine monohydrate and only use the CreaPure because I know how that's manufactured.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and I would add, it's not only the manufacturer, it's what has been studied. 99.9% of all the thousands of creatine studies been performed have been on creatine monohydrate from Germany. And there's a reason, because it's the highest purity. And if you look at even in European Union, they specifically say it has to be a high pure creatine to be able to withstand their qualified health claims that they're allowed to make about creatine. So, I don't say what type, but I always tell people look for the German creatine monohydrate with the CreaPure label, and then you at least have that. And I agree with Jeff, just buy creatine itself, and that way you don't have to worry about anything else in the supplement. You can just focus on that, especially in kids.
Thanks to all of you. Another question is for Dr. Stout. Creatine transporters were discussed. In humans, there are different creatine transporters
Than animals, especially in herbivores. And I'm not an expert on this. This is Roger Harris. I wish he was here. This was a conversation he and I had because he had said that, the horse being an herbivore probably wouldn't have the same absorption of creatine that a human would. And so the reason he was telling me that story is because he was testing to see if creatine actually worked in horses. And if he would have done it, he would have found no effect, and they would have stopped the 1992 article that I've heard few people mention now in their studies, and we may not be here today. with all the research that had been done, because the Haltman and Bergstrom lab was the lab in the world that would say creatine doesn't work. And if they said it didn't work, then nobody seriously, we're going to take, nobody's going to take creatine seriously. So I think that was the purpose of it. But again, I'm not an expert on creatine transporters in animals.
Very much. So another set of questions are open for anyone who's going to be interested to answer. Literature suggests that creatine supplementation downregulates creatine transporter. So is the mechanism known for how dietary creatine still enrich tissues concentrations of creatine?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and answer that since we did the bioavailability paper. To get creatine in muscle or brain, you have to go through digestion and increase blood levels of creatine. Then that creatine has to go through transporters, primarily in the tissues, and or be synthesized in the tissues through the creatine synthesis pathways. And ultimately, it's got to get into the tissue. And creatine transporters play a role, as Dr. Jagan mentioned earlier. There are some kids born without creatine transporter. They're deficient, and they have very low levels of creatine in muscle and in particular the brain that causes all type of problems. That's one form of creatine deficiencies that are more problematic to solve, because the ones with enzyme deficiencies, you just give them a lot of creatine and that normalizes a lot of their creatine stores. So the whole transporter issue is interesting. And there was a study probably 20, 25 years ago that showed if you take creatine and you increase creatine in the diet, your creatine uptake through the transporters is diminished. But once you stop taking creatine, it returns back to normal. And there's no long-term down-regulation of creatine through the transporters. And some creatine is actually diffused across membranes. And so as long as you have enough in the blood that's then pushing through the transporters, you're going to maintain your stores, and there doesn't appear to be any long-term detrimental effects of taking creatine for a while and then having it slow down transporters and end up with lower levels, like an anabolic steroid.
Thank you very much. Another question, very interesting one. Should women use a different doses in a different conditions compared to men?
I'll take that one. No. Actually, women, you can dose relative to weight, but I think if you just stick with the usual dosing of 5 grams a day or 4 times, to load for a few days and then maintenance. But we're finding, and there's a bunch of research that has shown anywhere from an increase in phosphocreatine levels in the muscle to the benefits on performance, very similar to both men and women. They benefit. It's interesting because less women take creatine, and probably they're the ones, as Dr. Kreider mentioned earlier, they're the ones who should be taking creatine based on their initial levels.
If I could just add there as well, we're currently in the process of conducting a pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamic study of creatine supplementation in pregnancy. And so we've undertaken a 5-gram single dose in late pregnancy, so at around 30 weeks. And we did one cohort of pregnant women, but also a matched cohort of non-pregnant women, expecting the absorption profile to look quite different in our pregnant women compared to the non-pregnants, because obviously there's a lot of weight gain with pregnancy. Your blood volume expansion is dramatic. There's lots of changes to cardiac output and also renal excretion. But surprisingly, we've actually seen that the absorption and elimination curves are actually quite similar. They're almost identical actually between the two populations. So again, just adding a little bit more information to that idea of fine adjustments for weight or body composition doesn't actually seem to be necessary, particularly in the female population.
Yeah, I would also add that when you creatine load and you take 0.3 grams per kg per day, separated in 4 doses, 5 grams on average, the first 2 or 3 days, you're saturating your muscle stores mostly 60, 80%. In the last 2 or 3 or 4 days of loading, you're only getting that last 10, 20% or so. And so once you get that loading phase, you start really getting those creatine stores saturated. There's a very little difference of 5 to 6 days versus 7 days. You're pretty much saturating the stores. And so I think women, that we know that they have a greater need because they typically don't synthesize as much creatine endogenously as a male. And they often tend to be more vegan type of diet, so they may not have as much dietary intake of creatine. So you would actually expect women to do better. And then if you look at Dr. Ellery's work, where during pregnancy there may be an extra 30% need of daily creatine intake, that all lends the question that as long as you get a good dose of 5 grams or so per dose, and you take it for several days, you're probably going to saturate those stores pretty effectively.
Thank you very much to all of you. Another question is for Dr. Benjamin Bax. Do you believe that CHO plus protein strategy to increase CR accretion would be useful in the long run, let's say in weeks, months, versus creatine alone?
I think it can certainly be beneficial in terms of whether loading with a protein or other type source, but based on what I've looked at in the research, that creatine alone, the differences are nebulous in the performance outcomes.
Yeah, let me add, we did some of those initial studies back in the 90s, and we gave creatine plus carbohydrate, creatine plus carbohydrate and protein, compared it to carbohydrate and protein alone or carbohydrate alone during training and NCAA Division I football players. And we were giving as much as 20 to 25 grams per day of creatine for 12 weeks. And we saw with that combination just very robust increases in muscle mass and strength. And we went to the loading and talking about, well, you probably just need to load and just maintain after that. When we want to put weight on an athlete, say we have an offensive tackle in the United States or a tight end in the United States at maybe 260 pounds, 120, 10 kilos or so, and we want to move them to an offensive lineman tackle and want to get another 40 or 50 pounds of muscle on them, that's still what we do. And so there are a few studies, if you look at some of our historical studies, that gave a lot of creatine per day with carbohydrate and protein. It worked better than carbohydrate alone. It worked better than carbohydrate and protein matched. And so that's what we still do when we have athletes that really need to put a lot of muscle mass on. We have them do that until they get as big as they need to be, and then we back them off. But it's kind of an interesting approach how we did that compared to what we do today.
Thank you very much. Another question is, again, for anyone who feels like to answer the question. How do you know who is non-responder to creatine supplementation?
I'll start with that. I think non-responder is a misnomer. What do I mean? Initial studies by Paul Greenhoff found that the bigger the change in muscle creatine, the more performance change, which makes sense, right? The more creatine, the more energy. But everybody responded to some degree. The only difference was that the people that started with higher creatine levels, like the story Dr. Stout talked about earlier, that they started at 150, didn't see as a robust change. And so what they did, they started giving creatine monohydrate with carbohydrate, and that made everybody get to that 20 to 30%. And then they gave it with carbohydrate and protein, and everybody got to that 20, 30%. So I think that it's basically whatever your level you start on creatine with. If you have a lot of meat and fish in your diet and your stores are relatively high, you may not see as much of a change. It doesn't mean you don't respond to creatine. It just simply you don't respond as much to creatine. And so what you can do then is add it with carbs and add it with carbohydrate and protein, and that extra glucose and insulin response seems to facilitate even greater uptake to maximize your creatine store. So everybody gets that 20 to 40% increase where you consistently see performance effects. Anybody else want to mention something or add something, Jeff or Andrew or Ben?
I'll add one more thing to that. Back in, I would say, in the 90s, late 90s, we were trying to figure that out. And we thought weight change would be the way to predict responders and non-responders. And we found that, especially in women, when we did the research, I worked with Dr. Joan Eckerson at the time, who's a co-author on Abby's paper. We found that women hardly gained any weight, but saw a significant increase in performance. And then you had some that didn't see as much. So we couldn't use weight. And with men, the relationship was not very good. So, so I know some people think that the weight gain is a predictor, and sometimes it may be as somebody who's a responder or not. But for men, maybe. For women, not so much.
Yeah, just kind of adding on to what Rick was saying, I think it probably comes back down to baseline creatine levels, and then also like our earlier conversation with training status. Someone may be closer to their kind of upper limit or genetic potential. They just may not see the same magnitude of improvement from that supplementation strategy as some of their fellow athletes or other individuals within that cohort.
Thank you so much to all of you. And the very last question, open to anyone, again, is creatine in long-term sports. How important would it be?
You mean endurance?
One word,
sports?
critical.
Long-term sports or long-term use in sports?
I think this is a beautiful closure.
Anybody have any? It's critical.
Yes.
We have had athletes that have taken creatine for 20 years. And I think as you get older, it's even more important to take creatine because of the muscle mass changes and the maintenance of exercise performance. And as we'll find out in the next few days, all the potential health benefits. So I think it's even more important to take creatine as you get older and try to keep that muscle mass and keep that performance and keep the strength so you don't fall and get frail and those type of things. So I say it's critical. I think, it used to be, it was unheard of to see a Tom Brady at 44 in the Super Bowl or playing at that level. Now it's kind of standard. You have a lot of athletes and basketball players and others that are having long-term careers because of nutrition and strength conditioning. And I can tell you a lot of the elite level, creatine 3 grams per day is part of the standard practice. I don't see how you can be competitive. You can be, Michael Jordan level, phenom. But if I can take the similar level athlete and have them, on creatine and carbohydrate loaded and, well-timed nutrients, and nutrition plays a key factor in performance, and they're able to sustain exercise capacity. So I think it's critical, especially if you're trying to maintain a career over time.
Yeah, I'm certainly going to certainly agree with Rick here, especially as we find ourselves with the advancement in training that has occurred and the advancement in nutritional factors and certainly supplementation with creatine. It's almost a necessity for an athlete to maintain that competitive parity with their competitors. And so I would say absolutely. I mean, as I spoke to my competitive years, even right now, I'm still utilizing creatine and outperforming those individuals, maybe who are not in that competitive realm so much, but outperforming those in terms of the amount of performance I'm doing as it relates to lifting weights, etc. To this particular day, and ability to recover between bouts as I get older, because I found that I was requiring more time to recover. Putting creatine back in as a part of my supplementation certainly aided me in not only being able to better tolerate the workouts, but also to recover between the balance of work.
Can I add just one last thing? So in 1992, during the Olympics, published in the biggest newspaper in Britain called the Herald, and they're interviewing one of the scientists for creatine, which the British team were using. All the athletes were on, which, if you remember, several of them won gold medals. But this is a quote by Dr. Harris in the study. Dr. Roger Harris and Professor Eric Haltman, they state, our research is conclusive. This is in 1992, said Dr. Harris. Although it sounds very dramatic, I believe it, or creatine, will completely change the face of sport. And then he goes on to say, we did not start out seeking to help the sportsman. There are dramatic implications for improving the quality of life of a 70-year-old. And that was back in 1992.
That's a great segue for tomorrow, because tomorrow we're going to pick up talking about creatine and rehabilitation, creatine in elderly and older populations, creatine in diabetes, creatine in women's health. As we go through the conference, we're going to start picking it up a notch to see how you can apply it throughout the lifespan.
So with all this being said, let me thank you to all of you, to all our speakers. We are extremely thankful that you all were with us today, and we really appreciate all your knowledge. We have learned a lot from you. I would like to say thank you to all of our participants. It's been really a pleasure to have you here, and thank you so much for all your questions. And also thank you very much to our coordinational team that make all this happen. And we will be very much looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Let me just, like Dr. Kreider just mentioned, let me give you a sneak peek what we can be looking forward for tomorrow. We are going to have presentations on the application of creatine supplementation in medical rehabilitation, then creatine supplementation in women's health, a lifespan perspective. Also, current evidence and future applications of creatine supplementation for older adults, creatine supplementation in brain health, and potential of creatine in glucose management and diabetes. So again, thank you very much to all of you. Enjoy the rest of the day, and we will be looking forward to seeing you tomorrow at 11 a.m. Thank you.